Hello students, this is the next in your sequence of grammar capsule sessions. Till now we have discussed all the components of a sentence which actually represent our thoughts, right? We discussed nouns, we discussed the verbs, and we discussed adjectives and adverbs. But since we were discussing nouns, we also discussed those structural elements that actually relate to nouns, namely pronouns and articles. Now we recognize that having done all the thought business, we have got to recognize that the certain things that bring these thoughts together into sentences, and these are what we would call connectives. And while there are, you recognize that pronouns and relative pronouns are also in some sense connectives of a kind. Your basic connectives are what we call prepositions and conjunctions. So we will do them in two sessions. This one is about prepositions. So what are prepositions? They are important when you want to construct sentences. Essentially, it's really difficult to give you rules for prepositions because there aren't any. So prepositions are probably the most difficult things for people who are not familiar with English as a spoken language to pick up. So all of us have the problem with it. The fact is that prepositions, there are only a limited number, about 100 or so prepositions, and all of us have seen all of them, but they are used in so many different ways that you can't even assign a rule to them at all. And therefore, why it is so difficult to study is that there is only one rule. There is one rule. What is that rule? That it brings in a noun and connects it to some other thought in the sentence. That's it. That's the only thing you can say about a preposition. The preposition brings a noun in or a noun situation in and connects it to some other part of the sentence by relating the noun to that sentence, to some other part of the sentence by relating the noun to that word or that phrase in the sentence. That's it. That's the only rule, which is why it's so difficult. You recognize prepositions because you pay attention to words that come in, nouns that come in, and what preposition you actually bring that noun within. And therefore, when you learn vocabulary, especially nouns, pay attention to the verbs, the prepositions that you use along with those nouns. All right. So now the word that the noun that the preposition brings in is called the object of the preposition, right? And therefore, if it is always the object, and therefore it will always be in the manner of an object. So if you are going to replace that noun with a pronoun, okay, then the pronoun actually has to be in the objective case, right? So even if that pronoun represents something that is actually part of the subject of the larger sentence, it would still be in the objective case because it comes after a preposition. Just keep that in mind. The sample there tells you that, no? The letter addressed to him arrived in the mail today. You recognize the basic sentence, the overall sentence has the letter addressed to him is the subject, arrived is the verb, in the mail today is what we are talking about, right? It arrived. How did it arrive? In the mail today. Now I have got the letter addressed to him. You might say, but when we studied pronouns, we realized that you say he when it is the subject, but him when it is in the object. But here the subject is not he or him, the subject is the letter, and it's the letter addressed to, and therefore I have to bring in it was addressed to the person who received it. So the letter addressed to him. So whatever it is you bring in as a noun or noun situation along with a preposition, it will always be worded the way an object is worded in the objective case, right? Just keep that in mind. Let's move on a little bit. So as I said, there is very little by way of rule that I have to tell you about a preposition. There aren't any, and even if you look up a grammar textbook, you will find that there aren't. It's only examples of how they have to be used, and therefore you just pay attention to them when you read. But what we can look at, and more just for knowledge of it, and not because it actually helps us greatly when we actually put sentences together, let's recognize that prepositions actually form relationships between nouns and other parts. And what kind of relationships? Either of accompaniment, or of time, or of place, or of direction, or of agency, the one that does, or of method or process or manner. Accompaniment would be with and things like that. Time would be at or in or whatever. Place would be at or in whatever. Direction would be to or towards. Agency would be by. Method, process or manner would be by. Okay, and so on. So these are prepositions. These are the functions that they have. Then they also form part of prepositional phrases. Sometimes we have a whole phrase that works like a preposition with reference to, in the case of, in the matter of, on behalf of. You recognize you can't split these things and say this is one word, that's another word. The whole phrase works together the way a preposition does with the reference to something. That something then gets connected to the rest of your sentence. So those are what we call prepositional phrases. And prepositions also work as part of what we call phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs are also in some sense like vocabulary. You just have to pick them up from reading. A verb which is followed by a particular preposition, sometimes that combination has a meaning other than the verb itself. Now if you take the word give, we know what the word give is, but suppose you say given, by given we mean surrender. When you say give up, we mean to when someone feels exhausted or just stops making an effort. So give as a verb when added to certain preposition can derives a phrasal verb meaning. Alright, let's also say put Now we know what put is. Put is to place something, right? But when you put up, then you tolerate. When you put by, you actually put something aside to save, isn't it? So these are what we call phrasal verbs. Again, there is no explanation behind phrasal verbs, just like there is no explanation behind prepositions. These things are in a sense idiomatic. Because they simply come out of traditional use, you have to learn them the way you learn vocabulary. In the case of prepositions, you must learn them with the vocabulary that you learn. In the case of phrasal verbs, you learn them just like you learn verbs. Alright, so let's move on a bit. And again, by way of knowledge more than anything else, because this doesn't really make a difference to how prepositions are used, you have different kinds of prepositions. You have simple prepositions, which are the single word prepositions. You have compound, which are actually one word which combines two in them, like without, inside, etc. You have double ones, which are actually two together, like out of, from, behind, and so on. And you have participle prepositions, which are in some sense like your ing. Now it seems like it's worded like a participle, but it's actually a preposition. When you say considering this, and then you know that, or considering his letter, that means in the matter of, isn't it? Therefore, you recognize that you can have participle prepositions also. So you have simple, compound, double, and participle. Again, does this make a difference to us in terms of the use? No, they all get used by way of that one single rule that we talked about. They bring in nouns and they connect them to other parts of the sentence, and the noun has to be, the noun or noun situation has to be in the objective case, right? So that is all we can actually talk about in terms of prepositions. You have to watch for it in the reading that you do. Now let's move on to conjunctions. Alright, we talked about the other connective that we have. This one, at least there is something that we can talk about. What is a conjunction? It's a joiner. It connects or conjoins parts of a sentence. Now these parts of a sentence might be words, they might be phrases, they might be clauses, they might be, and clauses would mean complete ideas, right, being brought into the same sentence. Now what does the conjunction do? A preposition relates one to the other, draws a relationship. A conjunction presents things together. But there are two slightly different types of conjunctions. We have what we call the coordinating conjunction, and we have the subordinating conjunction. What coordinating conjunctions do is, whatever it is that they add, they leave them at their in their individual value. They don't actually make one less valuable than the other. But subordinating conjunctions would mean that whatever is brought in some sense supports some part of a main clause. Some part of a main clause gets supported, and therefore it becomes subordinate to the main clause. So there's a slight difference there. Most of the conjunctions that we use are coordinating. I mean, the most frequently used ones are coordinating conjunctions, but there aren't so many of them. There are only these 7 that we have there, that you have on the screen. Those are your coordinating conjunctions, but they get used very, very often. I mean, these are the ones that we typically use, but only these 7. Subordinating conjunctions are ones that actually bring in a piece of information. It's to be looked at in the value that it has, but it's connected to not just the entire idea that I have, it's connected to some part of a main clause. So while coordinating conjunctions can actually connect words and phrases, a subordinating conjunction will simply connect clauses to clauses, but one clause then becomes a subordinate to another clause because it relates to some part of a main clause. So just remember that distinction, and you'll actually be able to handle these correction areas fairly comfortably. Let's move on. The other thing that we do need to remember is what we call the correlative conjunction. Now what's a correlative conjunction? It's the conjunction appears in pairs because it's actually joining sentence elements that are actually to be treated in pairs. So when I say either or, then the either brings in something and the or brings in something. The neither nor, the neither brings in and the nor brings in something. Not only but also, the not only brings in something, the but also brings in something. So what are we saying? Correlative conjunction will always appear in these pairs, and with each part of the pair will refer to one element that you want to look at, and these elements need to be grammatically equal. They also need to be grammatically parallel. You can't they have to be similar and not exactly the same but similar. They can't be entirely different. Alright. So if I say not only but also, they have to be similar to the idea that I am delivering, or neither nor, they have to be similar in the idea that I am delivering. I don't mean similar in terms of, let us say, overall experience, human experience, right? So these are what we call correlative conjunctions. What's our problem with correlative conjunctions? Not much really, except for the fact of placement. We tend to make mistakes with that. We'll discuss this in later class as well when we talk about sentence structure, but let's just keep in mind, if I'm offering a correlative with two elements that are to be looked at as equal, then very clearly it must be placed before those elements only. Now if I have, let us say, if I want to talk about the fact that my brother reads, and let's say, comics and books. Now if I want to use an either or for comics and books, I should say my brother reads either comics or books, because if I say my brother either reads, then the either reads would mean that the or also has to come into the verb. So whatever, where do you place these correlatives? Before the two elements that you actually want to offer as options, right? So, and these elements then are treated grammatically equal. Then we have these things that we call conjunctive adverbs, which means they are basically adverbs, but you can sometimes use them as conjunctions in a certain context. I have got two of them there. Let us look at that. Let us look at however. Now, if I say that you are required to work hard, however, you will be paid a good salary for it, right. So, you are required to work hard is an entire statement. However, you will be paid a good salary for it would mean that you will be paid a good salary is even though you have to work hard, you will be paid a good salary. So, that means do not worry about it, you are going to get good salary for it. But suppose I say however hard you work, you can't get salary. Now, however hard you work would mean that however becomes an adverb that describes hard, however hard you work. So, I can actually look at adverbs that work as conjunctions. Consequently, same thing, isn't it? Now, this was consequently the result, isn't it? So, consequently the result would mean consequently is an adverb. But if I say he did this, consequently that happened, then it becomes a conjunctive conjunction, isn't it? So, this is what we call conjunctive adverbs. So, just keep those in mind also when you look at sentence correction.